I used to roll my eyes when night shift workers talked about the feeling. You know the one, that creeping sense that the world operates under different rules after midnight. That darkness doesn't just hide things, it changes them. I thought it was nonsense, superstition, the kind of stories bored security guards told to make their jobs sound more interesting. Then I spent 6 months watching over Mendelssohn Cemetery. Now, I don't work nights anymore, and I sure as hell never went back. I was 23, newly married, and drowning in student debt. My wife Sarah and I were living in my parents' old rental house, a weathered 2-story on the edge of town that sat uncomfortably close to Mendelssohn Cemetery. Close enough that on quiet evenings you could see the crooked headstones through our bedroom window. The cemetery wasn't one of those pristine, well-funded places with manicured lawns and respectful silence. Mendelssohn was forgotten. Headstones leaned at drunken angles, paths crumbled into dirt and weeds. Ancient oak trees had grown so thick overhead that even during the day, parts of it stayed in permanent twilight. When I saw the security posting, the pay caught my eye immediately, almost double what I'd been making at the gas station. 6 hours a night, 5 nights a week, 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. My only job was to sit in a small booth near the main entrance and maintain a visible presence. That's exactly how the ad phrased it. Maintain a visible presence. The interview lasted maybe 10 minutes. The manager, a gray-haired man named Mr. Carver, who looked like he hadn't slept well in years, asked if I was comfortable being alone, if I had a reliable car, if I startled easily. That last question should have been a red flag. But I needed the money, and the hours worked perfectly with my college schedule. I could study between rounds, sleep during the day, and still make it to my afternoon classes. I started the following Monday. The first week was exactly what I expected. Boring. I'd arrive at 9 p.m., unlock the small wooden booth that sat just inside the cemetery gates, and settle in for 6 hours of absolutely nothing. The booth was barely bigger than a phone booth, just enough room for a folding chair, a small desk, a space heater, and a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like a trapped wasp. I brought my textbooks, energy drinks, my phone charger. Most nights I saw maybe 2 or 3 cars pass on the main road. Never anyone entering the cemetery itself. By 11 p.m., the world felt completely abandoned. I liked it at first, the quiet, the solitude. Then came my second week. It was a Thursday night. I remember because I'd just finished a particularly brutal chemistry exam that afternoon. I was tired, caffeinated, and halfway through an article on my phone when I heard it. Footsteps right outside the booth. I looked up immediately, expecting to see someone standing at the window. Maybe a late visitor who needed directions, or someone from the maintenance crew. But when I turned on the exterior light and stepped outside, there was nothing. The path stretched empty in both directions. No cars in the parking area. No movement among the headstones. Just me, standing in a small pool of yellow light, surrounded by darkness and the smell of damp earth. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a stray dog. But the footsteps had been too deliberate, too evenly paced, too human. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned up the radio. After that night, it kept happening. Not every shift, but often enough that I started anticipating it. Around 1:30 or 1:40 a.m., always in that window, I'd hear something outside. Sometimes it was footsteps. Sometimes it was a dry, rasping cough that sounded like it came from an old man's chest. Once, I distinctly heard someone clear their throat, like they were standing right behind me. When I spun around, I was still alone. Each time I'd force myself to check. I'd open the door, shine my flashlight across the grounds, walk a few yards down the path, and each time there was nothing. No signs of disturbance, no footprints, no people. I started keeping a log, thinking maybe I could identify a pattern or report it to Mr. Carver. But what would I even say? I keep hearing invisible people? By my 4th week, I'd stopped investigating. I'd just sit there, door locked, hands wrapped around a lukewarm energy drink, and wait for whatever it was to pass. The worst part wasn't the sounds themselves. It was the waiting. Because I knew, somewhere deep in my gut, that something was testing me, learning my routine, seeing how I'd react. The night everything changed started normally enough. It was a Tuesday in late October, cold enough that I'd brought an extra jacket and a thermos of coffee. The cemetery looked different that time of year. Fog would roll in around midnight, thick enough to blur the headstones into abstract shapes. The trees seemed darker somehow, hungrier. I was reading a chapter on cellular biology when I heard them again. Footsteps. But this time, they didn't fade. They came closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow, measured steps on the gravel path, moving directly toward my booth. I set down my textbook and stared at the door. The footsteps stopped. Right outside. I could feel someone standing there. The same way you can sense when someone's watching you from across a room. The air pressure changed. The temperature dropped just slightly. I waited for a knock, a voice, something. Instead, I watched, my heart hammering in my throat as the door handle began to turn. Not quickly, not violently, slowly. Carefully, like whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing and didn't want to startle me. The lock held. Thank God the lock held. I sat frozen, not even breathing, as the handle rotated all the way to the right, testing the mechanism. When it didn't open, the handle held there for what felt like an eternity. Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 30. I honestly couldn't tell. Then, slowly, it rotated back to its original position. And the footsteps resumed. Not back toward the entrance. Deeper. Into the cemetery. I didn't move for another 20 minutes. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, there was nothing but fog and darkness. I called Sarah at 2:30 a.m., my hands still shaking. "Come home," she said immediately. "Just leave." "I can't," I told her. "I need this job." "Then I'm coming there." "No." I said it too quickly, too forcefully. "No, don't. I'm fine. It's probably just, I don't know, kids maybe, someone messing with me." But I didn't believe that. And neither did she. I almost quit the next day. I had the resignation email drafted and everything. But then I thought about our rent, the medical bills from Sarah's surgery earlier that year, the student loans that never seemed to shrink no matter how much I paid. So I went back. For 3 more weeks, nothing happened. No footsteps, no sounds. Just quiet, boring shifts where I actually managed to get through most of my assigned reading. I started to relax, started to convince myself that whatever had been happening was over. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was late November. The first real cold snap had hit, and frost covered everything in a thin, crystalline shell. I arrived at 9 p.m. as usual, settled into the booth, and turned on the small space heater. Around midnight, I noticed my breath was fogging, even with the heater running. I rubbed my hands together and tried to ignore it, but the temperature kept dropping. By 12:30, I could see my breath with every exhale, thick white clouds in the yellow light. That's when I noticed the window. The glass had fogged over completely, but not from the inside, from the outside. And in that fog, traced with what looked like a fingertip, was a single word: open. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. The writing was fresh, the lines still wet and clear against the condensation. Someone had been standing right there, inches from where I sat, and written that message while I was looking down at my phone. My hands fumbled for my cell. No signal. I grabbed the radio Mr. Carver had given me for emergencies. Dead static. And then I heard them. Footsteps, circling the booth. I don't know how long they walked around me. It could have been 20 minutes, it could have been 2 hours. All I know is that I sat in that chair, completely still, listening to the footsteps move in a slow, patient circle around the booth. Sometimes close enough that I could hear fabric brushing against the wooden walls. Sometimes farther away, crunching through frost-covered grass. There was more than one of them, I was sure of that. 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3, moving at different paces but never stopping, never leaving. The word on the window began to drip, the condensation running down the glass in slow rivulets, but I could still read it. Open. I thought about Sarah, about calling in sick tomorrow and never coming back, about every rational explanation I could conjure: teenagers, vagrants, someone playing an elaborate prank. But none of those explanations fit, because underneath the footsteps, I could hear something else. Whispering. Low, urgent voices, just below the threshold of comprehension, like someone reciting something in a language I'd never heard. The rhythm was wrong, the cadence too structured to be random. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept my eyes on the door. Around 2 a.m., my phone suddenly buzzed. 1 bar of signal had appeared. I immediately called Sarah, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting. Something's wrong. Don't come here. I'll explain later. The message failed to send. The signal disappeared again. The footsteps continued. At some point, I think around 2:45, they stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. All at once, mid-stride, like someone had hit a pause button. The whispering stopped too. The temperature in the booth was so cold now that frost had begun forming on the inside of the windows. My fingers were numb. My face ached. I sat there in absolute silence, waiting. Then quietly, I heard one final sound. A hand. It had to be a hand, pressing flat against the door. Not knocking, not scratching, just pressing. Like someone saying, "Goodbye." I didn't move until I saw the first gray light of dawn breaking over the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to stand, my legs had gone completely numb. I hobbled to the door, unlocked it with shaking hands, and stepped outside. The morning air felt shockingly warm compared to the inside of the booth. I looked around, searching for any sign of what had happened. The word on the window was gone, completely evaporated. There were no footprints in the frost, no handprints on the door. The gravel around the booth looked completely undisturbed. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. I got in my car and drove straight to Mr. Carver's office. He was already there, sitting behind his desk with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, like he'd been expecting me. "I quit," I said. He nodded slowly, not looking surprised. "Understood." "That's it? You're not going to ask why?" He folded his newspaper carefully. "I know why." "Then why didn't you warn me?" "Would you have believed me?" He looked up then, and his eyes were tired, so tired. Would it have made a difference? I didn't have an answer for that. He pulled an envelope from his desk drawer, my final paycheck already prepared. "You lasted longer than most." Most? But he didn't elaborate. I took the envelope and left. That was 8 years ago. I finished college. Sarah and I moved across town. I found a good job with normal hours and fluorescent lighting and living, breathing coworkers. I never told anyone the full story, not even Sarah. What would I say? That I'd been terrorized by invisible footsteps and messages written in frost? But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I'll look up Mendelssohn Cemetery online. The security booth is still there. I've seen it on Google Maps. And according to their website, they're always hiring night security. Always. I don't know what walks grew Mendelssohn after dark. I don't know what it wanted or why it chose to torment me instead of the guards before or after. But I learned something during those 6 months. Some places exist in both our world and somewhere else. And at night, when the barrier is thin, things can reach across. They can knock on your door. They can write messages. They can ask you to let them in. And the only thing protecting you is a flimsy lock and your own stubborn refusal to open the door. I kept that door closed. I hope whoever's sitting in that booth right now is doing the same, because some invitations should never be accepted, and some doors should never, ever be opened. I worked overnight at a small roadside motel for almost a year. People warned me about the job, but not because it was dangerous. They warned me because of the phone. According to them, it always rang when it wasn't supposed to, and whoever answered it never stayed long. I was 24 and desperate for work when I took the night desk job at Pine Hollow Motor Lodge. It was one of those places you only stayed at if your car broke down or you didn't have anywhere else to go. 1 floor, 12 rooms, flickering neon sign. The front desk sat directly across from a long hallway that disappeared into darkness after midnight. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The owner, a woman named Denise, showed me the basics and then paused at the phone. "If it rings after 2, she said, "don't answer it." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. The first few weeks were uneventful. Occasional late check-ins, a drunk couple arguing, a trucker asking for coffee. The phone never rang after 2. Until one night, around 2:17 a.m. It did. The sound echoed through the empty lobby, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. I stared at it. I remembered Denise's warning, but logic kicked in. Maybe it was a guest calling from a room. Maybe she just meant prank calls. I picked it up. There was breathing on the other end. Slow. Wet. Close. "Front desk," I said. "How can I help you?" The breathing stopped. Then, the line went dead. After that, it happened every night. Always between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. Always just breathing. Never a voice. If I didn't answer, the phone would ring until it stopped on its own. Exactly 13 rings. I started keeping count. On the 7th night, something changed. This time, after I picked up, a voice whispered, "Which room am I in?" The voice sounded wrong, like it was struggling to remember how speech worked. "I don't see your number on the caller ID. Can you tell me your room?" Silence. Then, "I can't see the door." I checked the hallway. All the room doors were closed. All the lights were off. When I returned to the desk, the phone rang again immediately. Same voice. "I hear you moving." My stomach dropped. I hung up. The phone rang again. "I'm cold," the voice said. "Did you lock me in?" I unplugged the phone. At 2:19 a.m., the lobby lights flickered, and from the dark hallway, I heard footsteps, slow, dragging, moving toward the desk. I hid in the back office until morning. At sunrise, Denise arrived like nothing was wrong. When I told her what happened, she sighed and opened a drawer beneath the desk. Inside were old incident reports. One name appeared over and over. A man who died of hypothermia in room 6 years ago after locking himself out during a winter storm. The final report ended with one line: "Phone disconnected. Calls continue." I quit that morning. Before I left, I looked down the hallway one last time. Room 6's door was open. The phone rang behind me. I didn't turn around. My name's Alex, and I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just off Highway 29 for about a year and a half. The shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and most nights it was just me, the fluorescent lights, and whoever needed cigarettes or gas at 3 in the morning. The pay was terrible, but I needed the money for school, and the overnight shift paid an extra $1.50 per hour. Plus, it was usually pretty quiet. I could do homework between customers, and most people who came in were just passing through. Truckers, night shift workers heading home, the occasional insomniac. About 4 months into the job, I started noticing a regular. He'd come in every Tuesday and Friday night, always between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m. He was maybe in his late 40s, average build, wearing different variations of the same outfit: jeans, a flannel shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His routine was always identical. He'd walk in, grab a pack of Marlboro Reds from behind the counter, pay an exact change, and leave without saying a word beyond thanks. No small talk, no eye contact, just in and out in under 2 minutes. I didn't think much of it at first. Working nights, you see all kinds of people with strange routines and habits. But after a few weeks, I started to notice something odd. He never arrived in a car. I'd watch the parking lot camera, and he'd just appear, walking up from the direction of the highway. And when he left, he'd walk back in the same direction and disappear into the darkness. One Friday night, around 2:20 a.m., I was restocking the coolers when I heard the door chime. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I'd memorized the schedule by that point. I walked back to the counter, and sure enough, there he was, standing in front of the cigarette display. But this time was different. He wasn't looking at the cigarettes. He was staring at me directly with this intensity that made my stomach drop. For the first time in all these weeks, I could see his eyes clearly beneath the brim of his cap. They were bloodshot and wide, like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him if he wanted as usual, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond immediately. He just kept staring at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 10 seconds. Then he said in this low, rough voice, "Do you know what day it is?" I told him it was Friday. He shook his head slowly and repeated the question, "Do you know what day it is?" I was confused, so I checked my phone and confirmed it was Friday, November 18th. He leaned forward, both hands flat on the counter, and said, "No, what day is it for you?" I didn't know what he meant, and I told him I didn't understand. He straightened up, pulled out exact change for the cigarettes, and placed it on the counter. Then he said something that still gives me chills. "You've been here 127 days. That's how long you have left." Before I could respond or ask what he meant, he turned and walked out. I watched him on the camera as he headed toward the highway and vanished into the darkness like always. I tried to laugh it off as just weird late-night rambling from an odd customer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I actually counted back. I'd been working there for 127 days at that point, exactly 127 days. The following Tuesday, I was dreading 2:15 a.m. I kept watching the clock, and when it hit 2:20, 2:25, 2:30, he didn't show up. I felt relieved, thinking maybe that was the end of it. But then, at 2:47 a.m., the door chimed. I looked up from my phone, and there he was. Same outfit, same cap, but something was different. He moved differently. Slower, more deliberate. He walked up to the counter and just stood there, not saying anything, not reaching for cigarettes. I asked if he needed anything, and he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. I looked down at it and my heart nearly stopped. It was a photo of the gas station, taken from across the highway. You could see the building clearly, lit up in the darkness. But that wasn't what terrified me. In the window, clearly visible behind the counter, was me. I was standing exactly where I was standing right now, looking down at something on the counter. I looked up at him, my hands shaking, and asked when he took this. He didn't answer. He just reached out and tapped the photograph 3 times with his finger, right on my image in the window. Then he said, 126 days. He turned and walked out before I could say anything else. I grabbed the photo and ran to the door, but when I looked outside, the parking lot was empty. He was gone. I called my manager immediately and told him I was locking up and leaving. I didn't care if I got fired. I drove home and didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I went back to get my things and quit on the spot. But here's the thing that still haunts me. I kept that photograph. I studied it obsessively, trying to figure out when it was taken. Based on what I was wearing in the photo and the paperwork visible on the counter, I was eventually able to narrow it down. The photo was taken exactly 127 days after I started working there. The same night he told me I had 127 days left, which meant, according to his countdown, I had 126 days from that final encounter. I counted down every single day, terrified of what would happen when I reached 0. I barely left my apartment for those 4 months. The day finally came. Day 0. I stayed home, doors locked, lights on. Nothing happened. The day passed completely normally. I felt stupid for being so paranoid, so terrified of some weird customer's cryptic warnings. But that night, around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to my phone ringing. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. There was silence on the other end, just breathing. Then, in that same rough voice, I heard, "You left. That wasn't part of it." The line went dead. I've changed my number 3 times since then, moved to a different state, and I haven't worked a night shift since. I still don't know what he meant, what I was supposedly counting down to, or what it was. All I know is that I think quitting that job might have saved my life, or changed something that was supposed to happen. I'll never know for sure, and honestly, I don't want to. I'm Marcus, and for about 8 months I worked as an overnight parking attendant at a 5-level parking garage in downtown Chicago. The job was simple: sit in the booth, collect fees from the few cars that came and went during the night, and make rounds every hour to check that everything was secure. The garage served a couple of office buildings and was generally dead after 8 p.m. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights I'd see maybe 10 cars total. It was boring, but it was easy money, and I could study for my certification exams between rounds. The parking garage had this layout where each level was slightly offset from the one below it, creating these weird blind spots where the security cameras couldn't quite see. During my training, my supervisor mentioned that people occasionally used these blind spots to sleep in their cars or do things they didn't want recorded. He told me if I ever found anyone, just wake them up and send them on their way, unless they were causing real trouble. For my first few months, I never encountered anything unusual. I'd do my rounds, check the stairwells, make sure no one had broken into any cars, and head back to the booth. The garage was well lit, and the echo of my footsteps on the concrete was the only sound. Then, about a month before I quit, I started noticing a car on level 4. It was a dark blue sedan, maybe 15 years old, with tinted windows. Nothing remarkable about it, except that it was always parked in the same spot, the far corner of the level, right in one of those camera blind spots. The first time I noticed it was on a Wednesday night around 1 a.m. during my hourly round. I logged it in my head, but didn't think much of it. But when I came back at 2 a.m., the car was still there. Same spot, lights off, no movement. By my 3 a.m. round, I started to get curious. The car had been there for at least 2 hours, possibly longer. I walked over to it, keeping my distance, and shined my flashlight through the back window. The inside was completely empty, no person sleeping, no belongings visible, nothing. The windows were too tinted to see into the front seats clearly, but I didn't see any movement. I checked the license plate against the system. The car wasn't registered to any monthly parker or business in the building. Someone had paid for a daily ticket and just stayed. I decided to leave it alone and continued with my rounds. But when I came back at 4 a.m., something had changed. The car had moved. Not to a different spot exactly, but it had shifted position. It was now angled differently, like someone had gotten in, moved it a few feet forward and to the left, and then parked again. I know for certain it had moved because I'd specifically noted its position relative to the support pillar next to it. Now there was more space between the pillar and the driver's side. The problem was, I hadn't seen anyone. I would have seen headlights if the car had started. I would have heard the engine. The garage echoed every little sound. But I'd been in the booth the entire time between rounds, and I hadn't heard or seen anything. I walked up to the car again, more cautious this time. I knocked on the driver's side window and called out, asking if anyone was in there. No response. I tried the door handle. Locked. I shined my light through the window again, and this time I could just barely make out the front seats. They were empty. I radioed my supervisor and explained the situation. He told me to just leave it alone unless I saw someone, or unless the car was still there in the morning. If it was abandoned, we'd have it towed during day shift. I went back to the booth, but I couldn't focus on my exam prep anymore. I kept watching the clock, counting down the minutes until my next round. When 5 a.m. came, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back up to level 4. The car was gone. I stood in the empty parking spot, completely confused. I'd been in the booth the entire hour. I had a clear view of the garage exit. No car had passed the booth. No one had paid to exit. The system showed no exits since 11 p.m. the night before. But the car was definitely gone. I checked every level, thinking maybe I'd somehow missed it moving to a different spot. Nothing. It was just gone. I reported it to my supervisor when he came in at 6 a.m. He pulled the camera footage from the exit and entrance. No record of the blue sedan entering or leaving the garage that entire night. He seemed skeptical of my story and suggested I'd maybe seen a car from a previous night and gotten confused. But I knew what I saw. I even had the license plate written down in my notebook. The next night, I came in for my shift already on edge. I did my first round at 11 p.m. and my heart sank when I reached level 4. The blue sedan was back. Same spot, same position, like it had never left. This time, I didn't wait for my scheduled rounds. I walked straight up to it and tried to look inside. The windows were too dark, but I could feel that something was off. The air around the car felt heavier somehow, colder than the rest of the garage. I was about to walk back to call my supervisor when I noticed something on the windshield. A parking ticket. Not one of our tickets. This was handwritten on a small piece of paper tucked under the wiper blade. I pulled it out and read it. In messy handwriting it said, Level 4, Space 47. Every night, don't look inside. My hands started shaking. I looked at the parking space number painted on the ground. 47. I shoved the note in my pocket and speed-walked back to the booth, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty garage. I spent the rest of that shift watching the level 4 camera feed, even though I knew the car was in a blind spot. At 3 a.m., I forced myself to do another round. The car was still there. I didn't approach it this time. When I came back at 4 a.m., the car had moved again, same slight repositioning like before. And at 5 a.m., I watched the camera feeds continuously, never taking my eyes off the exit booth. No car left, but when I went up at 5 a.m., the car was gone. This pattern continued for 3 more nights. The car would appear sometime before my 11 p.m. round, stay until around 5 a.m., occasionally shift position when I wasn't looking, and then vanish without ever passing the exit booth. On the 4th night, I decided I'd had enough. When I found the car during my 1 a.m. round, I walked right up to the driver's side window and cupped my hands around my eyes to see through the tint. I immediately wished I hadn't. There was someone in the driver's seat, sitting perfectly still, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, staring straight ahead. I couldn't make out facial features because of the tint and the angle, but I could see the silhouette clearly. I jumped back and yelled, asking if they were okay, if they needed help. The figure didn't move, didn't turn their head, didn't acknowledge me at all. Just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring straight at the concrete wall. I radioed for my supervisor, told him there was someone in the car and they weren't responding. He said he'd come in early to help handle it and told me to keep my distance until he arrived. I went back to the booth to wait, but I couldn't help watching the level 4 feed, even though it only showed the edge of that section. At 1:47 a.m., I saw movement on the camera, just a shadow passing through the frame, heading toward the stairwell. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and ran to the stairwell, taking the stairs 2 at a time down to the ground level. I burst out of the stairwell into the lobby just in time to see the exit door closing. I ran outside, but the street was empty. Whoever it was had vanished. When my supervisor arrived 20 minutes later, we went up to level 4 together. The blue sedan was gone. He was furious. Thought I'd wasted his time with a false alarm. He checked the exit footage. No cars had left. I showed him the note I'd found. He read it, handed it back to me, and told me to stop messing around. He didn't believe me. He thought I was pranking him or trying to get out of work. I quit the next day. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't spend another night in that garage, waiting for that car to appear and wondering who or what was sitting in the driver's seat. About a week after I quit, I saw a news story that made my blood run cold. A man's body had been found in his car in a different parking garage across town. He'd been dead for 3 days before anyone found him, sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel. The car was a dark blue sedan. The license plate number shown in the news footage was the same one I'd written down in my notebook. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know what I saw in that garage. But I know I'll never work overnight security again. And I'll never park on level 4 of any parking garage, anywhere. My name is Rachel, and I worked as a night auditor at a mid-range hotel near the airport for just under 2 years. For those who don't know, a night auditor is basically the front desk person who works overnight, usually 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and handles check-ins, guest requests, and the daily financial closing procedures. It's a pretty isolated job. You're usually the only staff member in the building aside from maybe a housekeeper or maintenance person, and most of the guests are asleep. The hotel I worked at had 120 rooms across 4 floors, and during the week, we'd usually run about 60 to 70% occupancy. This happened during my second winter there. It was a Tuesday night in January, and we were running at maybe 40% capacity, pretty dead even by our standards. I'd checked in my last guest around midnight, and by 1 a.m., the lobby was completely quiet. I was working on the audit paperwork when the front desk phone rang. Internal call from room 237. I answered with my usual greeting, and a woman's voice on the other end asked if we had ice machines on the second floor. I told her yes, there was one in the alcove near the elevators. She thanked me and hung up. Normal interaction, nothing weird about it. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Room 237. Same woman. This time, she asked what time breakfast started. I told her 6 a.m. on weekdays. She thanked me and hung up again. Third call came at 1:47 a.m., room 237. Before I could even finish my greeting, the same woman asked, "Is someone in the hallway?" I pulled up the second floor camera feed on my computer. The hallway was empty. I told her I didn't see anyone and asked if she'd heard something concerning. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I can hear footsteps, back and forth, right outside my door." I watched the camera feed closely. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty and still. I assured her that the hallway was clear and asked if she wanted me to come up and check. She said no, maybe she was just hearing things, and hung up. I kept the camera feed for the second floor open on my screen while I continued my work. At 2:03 a.m., the phone rang again, room 237. This time, the woman sounded genuinely frightened. She said the footsteps were getting louder, and now she could hear someone trying her door handle. I immediately pulled up the camera feed, still nothing in the hallway. I told her I was coming up right away and grabbed the master key card and my phone. I took the elevator to the second floor and stepped out into the hallway. It was dead silent except for the hum of the ice machine. I walked down to room 237, which was about halfway down the hall, and knocked gently, identifying myself as front desk. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. I called the room phone from my cell. I could hear it ringing inside the room, but no one picked up. I called the front desk from my cell and let it ring just to make sure the phone system was working. It was, but no answer from room 237. I used my master key and opened the door, calling out as I did. The room was empty. The bed was made perfectly neat, like housekeeping had just finished it. No luggage, no personal items, no sign anyone was staying there. The bathroom was empty too. I was completely confused. I checked the reservation system on my phone. Room 237 was marked as occupied, checked in at 11:47 p.m. the previous night under the name Sarah Mitchell. Prepaid reservation, 2 nights. But there was absolutely no one in the room and no sign anyone had been there. I went back downstairs and pulled the security footage from the front desk cameras. At 11:47 p.m., I saw myself checking in a woman, average height, dark hair, wearing a gray coat. I watched her take her key cards and head toward the elevators. I fast-forwarded through the lobby footage to the present. The woman never came back downstairs. I checked the second-floor hallway footage. At 11:51 p.m., I saw her exit the elevator and walk down the hall to room 237. She used her key card and went inside. After that, nothing. She never left the room, not once, right up until I went up there at 2:03 a.m. I sat at the front desk completely baffled. A woman checked in, called me 4 times from her room, and then vanished without leaving the room or the building. At 2:34 a.m., the phone rang again. I picked it up, and before I could say anything, that same woman's voice said, "Why did you come to my room?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked at the caller ID, room 237. I pulled up the camera feed. The hallway was still empty. I asked her where she was, told her I came to her room because she said someone was trying to get in. She said, very calmly, "I never said that. I said someone was outside my door. You're the one who tried to get in." I tried to explain that I knocked, that I called, that I was trying to help her. She interrupted me and said, "I can see you. You're still here. Why won't you leave?" My hands started shaking. I told her I was at the front desk, that I'd left her room half an hour ago. She said, "No, you're standing outside my door right now. I can see your shadow under the door. Please leave." I pulled up the second-floor camera feed and zoomed in as much as I could on the area outside room 237. There was no one there. The hallway was completely empty. I told her I wasn't there, that she needed to look through the peephole and see that the hallway was empty. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. "I'm looking at you right now. Why are you smiling like that?" I hung up and immediately called the police. I told them I had a guest who was either having a mental health crisis or someone was in her room threatening her, and I couldn't tell which. They said they'd send someone over. While I waited for the police, I kept watching the camera feed. At 2:51 a.m., the door to room 237 opened. I leaned forward, expecting to see the woman leave, or someone else, or something that would explain what was happening. No one came out. The door just stood open, and I could see a sliver of the dark room beyond. It stayed open for about 30 seconds, then it slowly swung closed. The police arrived 15 minutes later. I met them in the lobby and explained everything. We went up to the second floor together, and one of the officers knocked on the door of room 237. No answer. He knocked again, identifying himself as police. Still no answer. I used my master key to open the door. The room was exactly as I'd found it before. Empty, clean. No sign anyone was staying there. One of the officers checked the bathroom and the closet. Nothing. They took my statement and the guest's information. They said they'd try to contact Sarah Mitchell at the phone number on the reservation, but they seemed skeptical of the whole situation. After they left, I checked the reservation again. The phone number on file was disconnected. The credit card used to book the room had been declined when I tried to process a test authorization. It was invalid. But I had checked her in. I had her on camera checking in, going to her room. I had received 4 phone calls from her room phone. At 4:17 a.m., the phone rang one last time. Room 237. I didn't want to answer it, but something made me pick up. Heavy breathing on the other end. Then, in a whisper, "I'm still in here. You left me in here. Why did you leave me in here?" I hung up and blocked all calls from room 237 in the system. I spent the rest of my shift in a state of quiet panic, jumping at every small sound. When the morning shift manager arrived at 6:45 a.m., I told her everything. She checked the room herself, still empty. She pulled the phone records. They showed 4 calls from room 237 to the front desk, exactly when I said they occurred. We locked the room and marked it out of order. I went home and slept terribly. When I came back from my next shift 2 nights later, my manager pulled me aside. She said the previous night, the night auditor on duty had received calls from room 237. 3 calls. A woman asking about ice, about breakfast, and about someone in the hallway. The room had been locked and empty the entire time. I quit that night. I didn't even finish my shift. I told my manager I couldn't do it anymore, and I walked out. The hotel ended up permanently taking room 237 out of inventory. They never rent it to guests anymore. I heard through a former coworker that 2 more night auditors quit after receiving calls from that room, even though it was supposed to be locked and unoccupied. I don't know who Sarah Mitchell was, or if that was even her real name. I don't know if she was ever really there, or if something was just using her voice, her image, to mess with me. All I know is that I'll never work a hotel night shift again, and I'll never, ever stay in room 237 of any hotel anywhere. My name's Sarah, and what happened when I was 9 years old is something I've never been able to fully explain, no matter how many times I've tried to rationalize it. I grew up in a small suburb in Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor of our house, facing the backyard and the woods that stretched out behind our property. I loved that room because it felt like my own little world, especially at night when I could see the stars through my window. It was a Tuesday night in late October, a few days before Halloween. I remember because we'd just put up decorations and my mom had hung this plastic skeleton in my window as part of the display. I was supposed to be asleep, but I was reading under my covers with a flashlight, something I did pretty much every night. Around 11 p.m., I heard a tapping sound. Not loud, just a gentle tap, tap, tap on glass. I assumed it was a branch from the oak tree near my window, even though it was a calm night with barely any wind. I tried to ignore it and kept reading, but the tapping continued, getting slightly more insistent. Finally, I lowered my book and looked toward the window. That's when my entire body went cold. There was a man standing outside my 2nd-story window. Not on a ladder, not on the roof, just standing there in mid-air, like the laws of physics didn't apply to him. And he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but this wide, unnatural grin that showed way too many teeth. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just sat there in my bed, flashlight still on under the covers, staring at this impossible thing outside my window. He raised one hand slowly and waved at me, his fingers moving in this deliberate, mechanical way. Then he tapped on the window again, 3 times, never breaking eye contact with me. I finally found my voice and screamed for my parents. The man's smile somehow got even wider, and then he pressed his face against the glass. His features were all wrong up close. His eyes were too far apart, his mouth stretched beyond where a normal mouth should end, and his skin had this waxy, pale quality that didn't look quite real. My dad burst into my room, flipping on the light switch. I pointed at the window, still screaming, but when we both looked, there was nothing there. Just the plastic skeleton decoration swaying slightly, even though there was still no wind. My dad checked outside with a flashlight, walked the entire perimeter of the house, even got a ladder and climbed up to check if someone could have been on the roof. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt below my window, no signs that anyone had been there at all. He tried to convince me it was a nightmare, that maybe I'd fallen asleep while reading and dreamed the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't been asleep. I knew what I saw. Here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. The next morning, when I went to school, I mentioned what happened to my best friend Emma during recess. She got really quiet and asked me to describe exactly what the man looked like. When I did, she turned pale and told me that her older sister had seen the same thing 2 years ago in her second-story bedroom window, and that her family had moved to our neighborhood specifically to get away from that house. Emma made me promise not to tell anyone else about it. She said her sister had become obsessed with the smiling man, started drawing pictures of him constantly, and eventually had to go to therapy for months. She said the therapist told her family it was just a trauma response to a nightmare, but Emma's sister insisted to this day that it was real. For the next 3 weeks, I slept in my parents' room. When I finally moved back to my bedroom, I kept my curtains closed every single night. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear that tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 times. Always 3 times. I never opened the curtains to check, and I never told my parents it was still happening. We moved away when I was 12, and I've never experienced anything like it since. But I still can't sleep with curtains open, even now as an adult. And whenever I'm on the second floor of any building at night, I get this overwhelming urge to check over my shoulder, like something might be hovering just outside the window, waiting to wave at me with those mechanical fingers. Last year, out of curiosity, I tried to find Emma on social media to ask about her sister. I found Emma's profile easily enough, but when I looked through her family photos, I couldn't find any sister. Not in a single picture. When I messaged Emma to ask about it, she responded with just 2 words. What sister? I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what to make of any of it. I'm Marcus, and when I was 11 years old, my friends and I discovered something in the woods behind our school that we were definitely not supposed to find. It was the spring of 2007, and our group consisted of me, Jason, Tyler, and Kayla. We were those kids who spent every recess exploring the edges of the school property, looking for cool rocks, catching insects, and generally just trying to avoid organized sports. The woods behind our elementary school were technically off limits, but the fence had a gap in it that we could slip through, so we did it all the time. One Thursday afternoon, we ventured deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone before. Maybe a quarter mile in, we found this clearing we'd never seen before. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, almost like a table, and carved into the surface were these weird symbols that none of us recognized. They weren't letters or numbers, just strange geometric shapes connected by lines. Jason, who was always the bravest of us, climbed up on the stone and started tracing the symbols with his finger. As he did, he noticed that some of the lines formed a circular pattern, almost like a game board. That's when Tyler found the pieces. In the grass surrounding the stone were 4 smooth river rocks, each about the size of a golf ball, with the same symbols carved into them. Tyler picked them up and brought them to the stone, and we all started examining this weird discovery. Kayla said it looked like some kind of game, and Jason immediately suggested we try to figure out how to play it. I remember feeling uneasy about the whole thing, like we were messing with something that should be left alone. But I was also curious, and I didn't want to look scared in front of my friends, so I agreed. We spent the next hour trying to figure out the rules. We decided that each person would take a rock and move it along the carved lines, tracing the pattern. It seemed simple enough. Jason went first, placing his rock on one of the symbols and dragging it along a line to another symbol. Nothing happened. Tyler went next, then Kayla, then me. We went around in a circle maybe 5 or 6 times, moving our rocks along the pattern. On my second turn, I noticed something weird. The symbols on the stone were glowing very faintly, so faint that you could only see it if you looked closely. I pointed it out to the others, and Jason got excited, saying we must be doing it right. We continued playing, moving our rocks along the pattern. The glow got brighter with each turn. That's when the air started to feel wrong. It got heavier, harder to breathe, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The forest around us went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. Kayla said we should stop, that something felt wrong, but Jason insisted we finish the pattern, that we were close to winning whatever this game was. Tyler and I were split. Part of me wanted to stop, but another part was fascinated by what was happening. Jason made his next move, completing what looked like the final connection in the pattern. The moment his rock settled into place, all 4 stones started vibrating on the surface of the carved stone. Then they lifted off the surface, floating about 2 inches in the air, spinning slowly. We all backed away, and I remember Kayla starting to cry. The rocks spun faster and faster, and the symbols on the stone were now glowing bright enough that we could see them clearly even in the afternoon shade. Then, all at once, the rocks shot outward, flying into the woods in 4 different directions. One of them whizzed right past my head, close enough that I felt the air move. We all stood there in shock for a moment, and then we ran. We sprinted back through the woods, through the gap in the fence, and didn't stop until we reached the school building. We agreed not to tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe us anyway? We'd just sound crazy. But here's where it gets really disturbing. That night, I woke up to find one of those rocks sitting on my nightstand. The same rock I'd been using in the game, with the same symbol carved into it. I know it was the same one because I'd noticed a small chip on its surface during the game. I threw it in the trash immediately, but the next morning, it was back on my nightstand. I threw it in a dumpster behind a grocery store a mile from my house. 2 days later, it was in my backpack. No matter what I did, the rock kept coming back. After about a week of this, I finally told my mom everything. She didn't believe me about the floating rocks or the game, but she could see how distressed I was about this rock that kept appearing. She took it from me and said she'd get rid of it. I don't know what she did with it, but it never came back after that. I called Jason the next day to see if his rock had come back too. His mom answered and said Jason was sick, that he'd been having terrible nightmares and was running a fever. Tyler's parents said the same thing when I called him. And when I tried to call Kayla, her dad told me that Kayla didn't want to talk to me or any of us anymore, and that we should stop calling. The 3 of us never really spoke about what happened in those woods. We drifted apart after that spring, which was weird because we'd been inseparable before. By middle school, we'd barely acknowledged each other in the hallways. I moved away for college and lost touch with everyone from elementary school. But last year, I was back in my hometown visiting my parents and decided to drive by the old school. The woods are still there, and the fence still has gaps in it. I sat in my car for 20 minutes debating whether to go back and find that clearing to see if the stone was still there. I didn't go. Some part of me knows that if I found it, if I touched those symbols again, that rock would come back. And I don't think I'd be lucky enough to have my mom make it disappear a second time. My name is Jessica, and when I was 8 years old, I had a babysitter who gave my parents a list of rules that still doesn't make any sense to me, even as an adult. This was back in 2003, and my parents had a wedding to attend about 3 hours away. They'd be gone overnight, so they hired a babysitter through a local agency. Her name was Margaret, and she was a college student in her early 20s. She seemed nice enough when she arrived that Saturday afternoon, quiet, polite, and she brought a backpack full of activities to keep me entertained. My parents went over the usual information, emergency contacts, bedtime, what I was allowed to eat, that sort of thing. That's when Margaret pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to my mom. She said it was a list of rules she needed my parents to go over with me before they left, rules that I had to follow while she was babysitting. My mom unfolded the paper and started reading it out loud. I remember her voice getting quieter and more confused as she read. Jessica must be in bed with the lights off by 8:30 p.m. Jessica is not allowed to look out any windows after 8 p.m. If Jessica hears knocking, she should not answer it or ask who it is. If the phone rings after 9 p.m., Jessica should not listen to the conversation. Jessica must stay in her room with the door closed after 8:30 p.m. If Jessica hears voices that aren't mine, she should cover her ears and count to 100. Under no circumstances should Jessica open the basement door. My dad laughed and asked if this was some kind of joke. Margaret didn't laugh. She said these rules were for my safety and that they'd been provided to her by the agency for this specific address. She'd said she'd babysat in houses with special instructions before, and it was important that everyone followed them exactly. My parents were clearly uncomfortable, but they also needed to leave soon if they were going to make the wedding. After some back and forth, they agreed to the rules, probably assuming Margaret was just overly cautious or following some weird protocol. They went over the list with me, made me repeat each rule back to them, and then left. The first few hours were normal. Margaret and I played board games, she made me dinner, and we watched a movie together. She was actually really nice, and I remember thinking the rules were silly and unnecessary. At 7:45 p.m., Margaret reminded me that I couldn't look out the windows anymore. I asked her why, and she said very seriously, "Because we don't want them to know you're here." I asked who "them" was, and she just shook her head and said it was better if I didn't know. At 8:30 p.m. sharp, she walked me to my room and told me to change into my pajamas. She said she'd be right outside in the hallway if I needed anything, and that I should try to go to sleep. I wasn't tired at all, so I just lay in bed in the dark, staring at my ceiling. Around 9:15 p.m., I heard the phone ring downstairs. It rang 4 times, and then stopped. Then, a few minutes later, I heard Margaret talking on the phone. Her voice was different, tense, worried. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I remembered rule number 4. If the phone rings after 9 p.m., don't listen to the conversation. I put my pillow over my ears like I was supposed to, but I could still hear the murmur of her voice. After a few minutes, it stopped, and I heard her footsteps coming up the stairs. She knocked on my door and asked if I was okay. I said yes, and she told me I was doing great following the rules. Around 10 p.m., the knocking started. Not on my bedroom door, on the front door downstairs. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more knocks. This pattern continued for what felt like forever. I remembered rule number 3. Don't answer it or ask who it is. I pulled my blanket over my head, trying to block out the sound, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, muffled but clear enough, calling my name from outside. Jessica. Jessica, come to the door. Jessica. It wasn't Margaret's voice. It was deeper, stranger, and there was something wrong with the way it pronounced my name, like each syllable was stretched out too long. I heard Margaret's footsteps in the hallway, pacing back and forth. The voice kept calling my name over and over. Jessica, we know you're in there, Jessica. Come to the door. Then I heard other voices. At least 3 or 4 different voices, all calling my name at once, overlapping each other. Some were high-pitched, some were low, but all of them sounded wrong somehow. I remembered rule number 6. If I hear voices that aren't Margaret's, cover my ears and count to 100. I pressed my hands over my ears as hard as I could and started counting. 1, 2, 3. I could still hear them through my hands. 27, 28, 29. The voices were getting louder, more insistent. 63, 64, 65. At some point during my counting, the voices stopped. By the time I reached 100, the house was completely silent. I slowly lowered my hands from my ears and listened. Nothing. No voices, no knocking, just silence. A few minutes later, Margaret knocked on my door again and asked if I was okay. I said yes, and she told me I was very brave and that everything would be fine now. She said I could go to sleep, that they were gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay in my bed, listening for any sounds, terrified that the knocking or the voices would start again. They didn't. My parents came home the next morning around 10 a.m. Margaret was already gone. Apparently, she'd left at 7 a.m. after making me breakfast. My parents asked how everything went, and I told them about the knocking and the voices. My dad checked outside for any signs of vandalism or footprints, but there was nothing. My mom called the babysitting agency to complain and ask about the strange rules. According to her, the agency had no record of anyone named Margaret working for them, and they certainly didn't provide babysitters with special instructions for specific addresses. My parents tried to find Margaret to get answers, but they couldn't. No one by her description or name had been enrolled at the local college. It was like she'd never existed. The weirdest part? About a week later, my mom found an envelope in our mailbox addressed to me. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for following the rules. You kept yourself safe. M." We moved out of that house 6 months later for unrelated reasons, but I know my parents never felt comfortable there after that night. And honestly, neither did I. I'm 30 now, and I still think about those rules sometimes. What would have happened if I'd looked out the window? What if I'd asked who was at the door? What if I'd opened the basement door? Part of me doesn't want to know, but another part of me wishes I could find Margaret again and ask her what she knew about that house, about whatever was outside that night calling my name. I guess some questions are better left unanswered.